The year was 1893, and the docks of the sprawling port city were waking up with a raw, brutal energy. It was always cold here, a bone-deep chill that the sun, even at its midday height, seemed unable to fully dispel. The air was a heavy, pungent blend of industry and ocean, the metallic tang of brine, the sweet rot of discarded fish guts, and the dense, smoky breath of 100 coal-fired steamers in the harbor. This particular morning, however, possessed a deceptive, almost shimmering quality. The recent catch had been monumental, and the wooden stalls of the fish market were overflowing. Cod, haddock, and silver-scaled herring were piled high on crates slick with water, their surfaces glistening under the pale, watery Victorian light. A constant, deafening chorus of gulls wheeled overhead, their cries competing with the rough shouts of the market vendors. Young Thomas Alcott, barely 8 years old and small for his age, was simply another fixture in this daily spectacle. His presence was so mundane, so unremarkable, that no one who saw him that day would have later recalled a specific detail, save for one. His task was simple: help his mother carry a basket for their meager purchase, then hurry home. He stood near a towering stack of wooden crates, near where a particularly boisterous fisherman was weighing a haul of mackerel. Thomas was gazing not at the fish, but toward the mouth of the pier, his expression a mixture of childish boredom and quiet observation. The photographer, a commercial portraitist who occasionally tried his hand at street life for his wealthy clientele, knelt briefly to capture the raw energy of the market. The resulting image was a chaotic, brilliant study of the dock's life. A mass of fishermen, the glint of fish scales, and in the foreground, the small, solitary figure of Thomas Alcott. It was precisely 10 minutes past 8 in the morning when the flash powder ignited, freezing Thomas in that single, fateful moment. Within the hour, the salt-laden mist would begin to roll in, thick and silent, erasing the edges of the world. And Thomas, the boy who was so unremarkable he blended with the wood and the crates, would be gone. The mackerel purchase had taken no more than 20 minutes. For Mrs. Alcott, that brief span of time felt like an eternity, an empty pocket of silence in the usual clamor of the market. She turned from the vendor, her coin purse tucked away, ready to retrieve Thomas and head back toward the tenement. But the space where she had left him, by the tall stack of empty crates, was now simply empty. Initially, a small, reasonable voice in her mind suggested he had wandered, perhaps distracted by a dock dog or a passing carriage. It was a chaotic place, after all. She called his name, her voice tight but still contained. "Thomas! Where are you, boy?" The sound was swallowed instantly by the shouts of 3 shillings a pound, and the groan of ropes against wood. Her search began as a brisk walk, then spiraled into a desperate, elbowing rush. She retraced the steps to the very spot visible in the photograph, her eyes darting between the bustling figures. None were Thomas. She questioned a few fishermen, men whose hardened faces rarely registered anything but the weather. They shook their heads, their focus entirely on the scales and the shillings. "Didn't see 'im, missus. Too busy." Then came the first spike of pure dread, cold and sharp as a shard of ice. She found his shoes. Not the good pair, but his rough, wooden-soled clogs, meant for the muck of the docks. They lay haphazardly overturned next to the spot where the silver herring had been piled, as if he had been pulled from them in haste, or perhaps left them deliberately to feel the cold wood under his bare feet. It was an anomaly. Thomas never took off his shoes outside. Clutching the small, empty clogs to her chest, the truth dawned with sickening clarity. He hadn't wandered. He hadn't been distracted. Thomas was gone, swallowed by the morning fog that was now creeping in from the open water, smelling of distant mud and an ancient, unforgiving cold. The mother's dread had turned into panic. The boy who had been photographed only minutes ago had vanished as completely as a breath in the bitter air. Mr. Alcott arrived minutes later, drawn by the strangled, panicked sound of his wife's cries. He was a dock worker himself, a man of routine and physical strength, but the sight of his wife clutching their son's muddy clogs instantly buckled his composure. Together, they returned to the exact coordinates where Thomas had been standing, the area next to the stall of the fisherman, an old man named Silas. Silas was known for his surliness and his near-total lack of curiosity about anything not directly related to the sea or coin. Yet, when Mr. Alcott, his voice raw with fear, pleaded with him, Silas paused. He shifted his weight away from the crates and pointed a gnarled, salt-cured finger at a particular fish box, a large, empty wooden container used for salting cod. "He was messing with that box," Silas rasped, his eyes squinting against the hazy light. "Just before the mist got thick, I saw him tugging at the rope, like he was trying to climb inside, or shut it." Mr. Alcott immediately examined the crate. It was heavier than it should have been, and upon closer inspection, the lid was held down by an unusually intricate, tightly knotted length of hemp rope, not the usual quick slipknot used for market goods. When he finally wrestled the lid open, it was empty, save for a thin, discolored piece of ribbon, a bright, almost unnaturally vibrant crimson color that certainly did not belong on the docks. The father's mind reeled. It was the only item left behind besides the shoes. As he tucked the strange ribbon into his pocket, Silas leaned in close, his breath smelling of stale tobacco and the ocean's deep. "'Tain't he the tide that took the boy, Alcott?" the old fisherman whispered, his voice low and guttural. "It's the fog. The fog always takes the quiet ones. They call it the sea tribute here. And what the docks take, they don't give back. Forget the police, forget the rope. Mind the watcher on the shore." Silas offered no further explanation, returning to his fish as if nothing had transpired. But his grim, cryptic warning hung in the thickening air, adding a layer of cold terror to the empty weight of the crate and the silent accusation of the child's ribbon. The walk from the docks to the nearest police station was a march of mounting desperation. Mr. and Mrs. Alcott were figures of raw grief, their presence in the crowded streets barely registered by the city's indifference. At the station, the atmosphere was a stale blend of disinfectant, damp wool, and cynical resignation, a far cry from the vibrant, if brutal, life of the fish market. They were met by Constable Hemlock, a man whose mustache drooped as heavily as his demeanor. He listened to their fragmented account, the bustling morning, the simple errand, the overturned shoes, the mysterious red ribbon, with the practiced detachment of one who has heard too many sad tales ending with cold water and no answers. Hemlock did not bother to open a ledger for the report immediately. He merely tapped a pencil against a stack of official forms. "Another dockside youth, is it?" he sighed, his voice flat. "See here, Mr. Alcott. This is a port city. Children wander. Children fall. And, regrettably, some children are too often sold away onto deep-sea vessels or to unsavory characters across the district. We have a dozen similar cases this month alone." His dismissal was crushing. Their grief was reduced to a statistic, their Thomas merely another dockside youth. When Mr. Alcott finally produced the only concrete evidence, the photograph taken moments before the vanishing, Constable Hemlock took it with a sigh of irritation. He held the image up to the gaslight. The bustle, the catch, the boy standing so small and precise, it was all there. "A fine picture, I suppose. But it proves nothing but that your son was at the docks at 8 o'clock. This is not a murder, it is a mislaying," Hemlock stated, circling the date with his pencil. The Alcotts left with no promise of a search, no promise of patrols, only the cold, hard advice to wait a day or two, he might simply turn up. The only thing Hemlock kept was the photograph, tossing it onto a pile of other unsolved, forgotten reports. The bureaucratic indifference of the city had sealed the case shut before it had even been opened, leaving the terrifying vacuum of Silas's warning and the mystery of the crimson ribbon as the family's only leads. The disappearance of Thomas Alcott was, to the city, a droplet lost in the vast ocean of Victorian misfortune. But to Mr. Elias Thorne, a man of both leisure and peculiar obsessions, it was a wrinkle in the fabric of the ordinary. Thorne was a minor journalist for a specialized society magazine, though his true passion lay in the nascent art of photographic forensics and the grim curiosities of urban life. He collected tragedy, not out of malice, but a desperate need for intellectual engagement. Thorne arrived at the police station a day after the report, not to interview Constable Hemlock, whose indifference was already legend, but to simply retrieve the official documentation for the all-caught Miss Lang. He managed to acquire a hasty, smudged print of the market photograph, slipping a shilling to an overworked desk clerk to ensure he got the original plate's clearest copy. Back in his cluttered gaslit study, surrounded by stacks of obsolete city maps and daguerreotypes of the recently deceased, Thorne laid the image under his magnifying glass. It wasn't the boy who captivated him, nor the fish, nor the general bustle. It was the atmosphere, the perfect stillness of the subjects captured amidst the chaos. He noted the exact timestamp on the original report, matching it to the position of the sun. He noted the discarded clogs mentioned in the report, clearly visible in the foreground. But his gaze kept drifting to the dark recess of the frame, the area behind the stacked crates, partially obscured by the morning fog's initial advance. There was a figure there, indistinct and shrouded in shadow, watching Thomas. "The watcher on the shore," Thorne murmured, recalling the dock's ancient, superstitious lore that whispered of figures who took souls when the fog was thickest. This wasn't a myth. This was a man, or a shape, rendered almost invisible by the poor light and the hurried composition. It was this anomaly, this silent, dark observer, that transformed the routine case of a missing child into a compelling mystery for Elias Thorne. The boy had not simply vanished, he had been taken, and the camera had caught the taker's silhouette. Elias Thorne's darkroom was a sanctuary of chemical odors and red light, a world away from the humid chaos of the docks. He had obtained the best possible glass plate of the market scene, and now, fueled by strong coffee and an academic hunger, he set to work. His goal was not simply a picture, but a map of shadows, a means to pull detail from the areas the cheap lens and hurried composition had ignored. He used a meticulous, high-contrast developer bath, a technique usually reserved for documenting celestial bodies, forcing the dense silver particles in the negative to reveal texture hidden in the deepest blacks. The process was slow, agonizingly precise, but when he finally fixed the positive print and held it under his magnifying glass, the revelation was stunning. The initial print had shown a mere smudge, a vague, darker form behind the wooden crates near where Thomas had stood. The high-contrast image, however, solidified the shape. It wasn't the play of light and fog, nor a smudge on the plate. It was, unequivocally, a human figure. The watcher was tall and unnaturally slender, draped in heavy, dark cloth that seemed to absorb all available light. Its face, though still indistinct, tilted forward, the angle suggesting a fixed, almost predatory focus on the small boy. The most unnerving detail was revealed near the figure's hands, a thin, almost invisible line, leading down toward the area of the empty crate, the very crate where the crimson ribbon had been found. Thorne felt a cold dread settle over him, the sensation less one of shock and more one of grim confirmation. This was no accident, no wandering child lost to the sea. The boy had been monitored, isolated, and taken by a meticulous, unseen agent. The photograph, meant to capture the noise of life, had instead captured the silent preparation for death. The watcher was real, and the ribbon was likely just the bait on its line. Armed with the stark proof of the high-contrast photograph, Elias Thorne knew the police would offer no help. His investigation had to proceed through the back channels of local knowledge, the whispers that clung to the piers like barnacles. He left the official records and instead plunged into the oldest, darkest taverns near the docks, seeking out the kind of hardened men who spoke in riddles and knew the true names of the district's ghosts. He found Silas, the old fisherman, brooding over a glass of cheap gin in a smoky den. The old man was initially hostile, distrustful of Thorne's clean clothes and sharp questions. But when Thorne mentioned the word watcher, Silas's eyes, usually dull with fatigue, sharpened with genuine fear. Silas recounted the legend of the sea tribute, an ancient belief, predating the modern harbor, that the sea was a demanding mistress who required a quiet sacrifice during the transition from the old month to the new, especially when the fog was heavy. But the true terror, he explained, was that the watcher was the collector of this tribute, a figure who didn't work for the sea, but for someone far darker on the land. "They ain't talking for the water, nor," Silas muttered, leaning in close. "They take for the collector. Children who are quiet, children who are small, children who are forgotten. Used to be a secret tunnel under the old fish stalls, meant for smugglers. they say the collector still uses it. Takes them to a place where they're kept, not drowned. This revelation shifted the focus from a maritime accident to a structured, deliberate crime tied to the area's forgotten infrastructure. The crimson ribbon found in the empty crate now seemed like a signature or a marker. Thorne had to locate the sealed-off areas and the old smuggling routes. The truth wasn't in the sea, it was buried deep beneath the bustling market, hidden in the very foundations of the city's commerce. Elias Thorne's inquiries had not gone unnoticed. His presence, a well-dressed man asking pointed questions about old legends and sealed tunnels, was a dissonant chord in the low, steady hum of the dock's illicit activities. The dock community was a network built on silence and fear, and Thorne had disturbed the foundation. He had arranged to meet with Finn, a young newspaper runner known for his sharp eyes and ability to traverse the maze of the piers unnoticed. Finn had seen the Watcher lingering in the fog on more than one occasion, and was meant to provide Thorne with a rough sketch of the figure and the entrance to the old smuggling route Silas had mentioned. Thorne waited at the agreed-upon location, a derelict warehouse known as the Silent Shed, for nearly an hour past the appointed time. Finn, known for his punctuality when shillings were involved, was nowhere to be seen. Thorne initially dismissed it as juvenile forgetfulness, but a chilling detail soon caught his eye. Scraped into the dusty floorboards near the warehouse entrance was a crude, hastily drawn image, a small, stick-figure boy with exaggerated wide eyes. Beneath it, smeared into the dust, was a single, unmistakable trace of crimson dye, the same vivid hue as the ribbon found in the empty crate. It was a terrifying, deliberate message. The Watcher was not only aware of Thorne's investigation, but was actively monitoring his contacts. Finn had not merely failed to show. He had become the second casualty of the Alcott investigation, a chilling demonstration of the collector's reach. The boy runner, a valuable potential witness, had been silenced, removed from the game, or worse. The Sea Tribute had claimed another, proving that the threat was current, precise, and lethally efficient at maintaining the dock's terrifying silence. The disappearance of Finn, marked by the sinister smear of crimson dye, was the catalyst. It shattered Elias Thorne's remaining academic detachment. This was no longer a puzzle to be solved in a warm study. It was a deadly hunt, and the predator knew he was tracking it. The police, of course, remained useless. If the boy runner had vanished, they reasoned, he was likely just another delinquent dodging trouble. Thorne realized he could no longer rely on witnesses. He had to go below ground, into the dockside labyrinth spoken of in the whispers. He procured a sturdy oil lamp, a coil of rope, and a rusty, but reliable, lock-picking set. Using an ancient map he'd salvaged, a cartographer's draft from the 1840s showing pre-development sewer lines and smuggling routes, he began his search for the secret entrance. The old map pointed toward a disused section of the pier, tucked behind a warehouse that stored rotting hemp. The entrance was cleverly disguised, a loose section of stone paving near a stagnant drainage channel. Working in the dead of the midnight tide, the smell of damp earth and trapped sewage was overpowering. After nearly an hour of strenuous effort, Thorne managed to pry the stone aside, revealing a narrow vertical shaft leading down into absolute blackness. He lowered the lamp, illuminating a cramped tunnel carved from packed earth and crude brickwork. The air was cold, thick, and utterly silent, a world away from the noise of the market above. This was the legendary smuggling route, the dark corridor the Watcher supposedly used. As Thorne descended, his foot slipped on something small and hard. He brought the lamp closer, a polished wooden toy soldier, painted red and blue, likely dropped in haste. It was a child's plaything, and it confirmed his greatest fear. He was on the right path, but he was hours, perhaps days, too late. He had entered the collector's domain. Descending into the black, silent network of tunnels, Elias Thorne relied entirely on his oil lamp and his salvaged cartographer's draft. The air was thick with ancient dust and the metallic scent of rust from forgotten railway spurs. These were not mere sewers, this was a forgotten artery of the city, a testament to decades of illicit trade and secrecy. The tunnels forked and twisted, a genuine labyrinth that would have hopelessly lost any casual intruder. Thorne, however, was prepared. He matched the geological markers on his map, a distinct subsidence here, a sealed-off brick archway there, to the cramped reality surrounding him. He was searching for the sunken vault, a location marked on the old draft as an unlisted storage space directly beneath the original timber pilings of the fish market, an area sealed off during the dock's last major modernization effort in 1878. After nearly an hour of crawling through cold, damp passages, he reached a section where the brickwork abruptly changed. The wall ahead was thick, mortared stone, obviously newer, with a faint, disturbing scratch mark near the base. It was the original entrance to the vault, deliberately and recently resealed. Thorne consulted his map one last time. The sunken vault lay precisely beneath the spot where Thomas Alcott had been standing, and where the empty crate and the crimson ribbon had been found. He confirmed the location by pressing his ear against the stone. Through the dense material, he could just discern a faint, rhythmic thump. Thump, thump. It wasn't the sound of the sea, nor the market above. It sounded like something mechanical, or perhaps, someone pacing. This was the watcher's hidden domain, the collector's lair. The cartographer's mark had led him right to the heart of the mystery, but the stone barrier now stood between him and any hope of finding the boy. Staring at the freshly mortared wall that sealed the sunken vault, Elias Thorne knew he faced an insurmountable obstacle. Brute force was impossible. Any significant noise would alert the watcher below or draw unwanted attention from above. He needed knowledge, the forgotten blueprints, the memory of how that section was originally constructed. His mind immediately went to the few living relics of the pre-modern docks. He found Ezekiel Crow, a former master dock architect now living in self-imposed isolation in a tiny, dilapidated cottage overlooking the sea. Crow was over 80, blinded by a mortar blast decades ago, and fiercely reluctant to speak of his past work, which included the very renovation that had sealed the sunken vault. Thorne spent hours gaining the old man's trust, speaking not of Thomas, but of the quality of the masonry and the specific type of Victorian cement used in the 1878 construction. Finally, after Thorne described the rhythmic thumping sound he'd heard, Crow's sightless eyes seemed to focus inward on a distant memory. "That wasn't a vault, son," Crow rasped, his voice brittle. "It was the collector's office, even back then. They called him the archivist of the docks. Used to gather curiosities, old papers. When we sealed it, I made a mistake, or perhaps I allowed for one." Crow then explained that the main entrance was a deception. He had built a small, secret bypass, a maintenance crawlspace disguised as a drainage sluice, that led directly into the vault, accessible only from the tunnel network. He drew a trembling diagram on a dusty table, showing a sequence of 3, almost invisible pressure stones that, when depressed in the correct order, would release the sluice door. The rhythmic thump Thorne heard, Crow revealed, was likely an old clock mechanism, a massive timepiece the archivist was obsessed with. He liked to count the hours of his collections, Crow finished, his voice heavy with guilt. Thorne had the key, but the old architect's words confirmed that the watcher was not merely a thief, but a man obsessed with time and the permanent preservation of his grim curiosities. The Victorian era, an age of rigid public morality, held a dark, paradoxical fascination with death. This macabre curiosity manifested most chillingly in post-mortem photography, the practice of posing the recently deceased, especially children, as if they were merely sleeping. This morbid art was an attempt to freeze life's fleeting finality and create a permanent, last portrait. Elias Thorne, a keen student of this genre, recognized the collector's potential motive. The man known as the archivist was obsessed with preservation and time, as evidenced by Crow's description of the huge, internal clock. He was not a murderer for malice or coin, but a collector of stillness. He desired to capture the subjects at their most perfect, unmarred, and eternally fixed state. Thorne shivered, his oil lamp flickering in the damp tunnel. The boy, Thomas, was quiet, small, and easily overlooked, the perfect specimen for an archivist who wanted his collection to be permanent, a living testament to the stillness he craved. The crimson ribbon, the wooden toy soldier, the empty crate, these were not merely tools of abduction, they were props in a grotesque, private staging. The realization injected a renewed, icy urgency into Thorne's pursuit. Finding Thomas alive felt increasingly unlikely. The archivist's intent was not to harm, but to preserve, a distinction that offered no comfort. Thorn feared that when he finally breached the sunken vault, he would not find a missing boy, but a subject eternally posed, a final, terrible post-mortem portrait achieved not through the lens of a camera, but through the deliberate, maniacal cessation of life. He had to reach the maintenance sluice immediately. Following Ezekiel Crow's near-blind instructions, Elias Thorn located the maintenance crawlspace hidden just below the mortared wall of the sunken vault. It was a tight, unpleasant squeeze, a space meant for pipes and debris, not men. He had to extinguish his lamp to fit, crawling forward in absolute, suffocating darkness, the thick, damp earth pressing close on all sides. He felt for the 3 pressure stones Crow had described. The first 2 were stiff but yielded to his sustained pressure. The final stone, positioned directly beneath a constant trickle of water, was almost immovable. He leveraged his shoulder against the low roof of the tunnel, pushing with desperate force until he heard a soft, mechanical click, the release of the sluice door's ancient latch. With a grinding groan, the floor of the confined space gave way, and Thorn slid down into a narrow, vertical cavity. He quickly relit his lamp. The space was no larger than a coffin stood on end, and the air was cloyingly warm, dry, and oddly scented, not of fish or water, but of chemical preservation and stale incense. At the base of the cavity, his lamp beam caught a small, unsettling collection. Neatly stacked against the wall were several identical wooden boxes, small enough to hold a few ounces of spices or pigments. Each box had a small, handwritten label affixed: red, blue, green. They were pigments, the kind used in painting or dyeing. But his eyes were drawn to a single, much larger box that lay open. Inside, nestled on a bed of dry cotton, was a child's simple woolen cap, its color a faded, dusty blue. And beside the cap, carefully placed, was a pristine roll of crimson ribbon, the source of the dye he'd seen marking Finn's disappearance. The boxes weren't just pigments, they were the collector's tools. They provided the color, and the crimson ribbon was his terrifying signature. Thorn was now standing in the collector's antechamber, the final barrier breached. Squeezing through the maintenance sluice, Elias Thorn dropped onto the cold stone floor of the sunken vault. The space was vast, circular, and disturbingly organized. It was not a smuggler's den but a collector's gallery, lit by a single powerful carbide lamp that cast long, dancing shadows. Against the far wall, a towering mechanical clock ticked with a loud, hypnotic thump, 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 that Thorn had heard from the tunnels. And then he saw him. The watcher, the shadowy figure from the photograph, stood near the clock. He was a man of about 50, dressed in immaculate, dark woolen clothes, his face pale and sharp, dominated by a pair of large, circular spectacles. He wasn't a brutish criminal, he was a refined, almost ethereal gentleman. He turned slowly, his eyes fixing on Thorn with an expression of mild annoyance, as if an insect had flown into his studio. "An intruder," the man stated, his voice quiet and precise. "You must be the journalist. You've spoiled the symmetry of the entrance." Thorn raised his lamp, illuminating the vault's contents. His blood ran cold. The archivist, for that was his self-appointed title, had assembled a grotesque tableau. Lining the walls were dozens of glass display cases, each containing the preserved artifacts of his previous collections. Small, faded woolen caps, discarded toys, tiny leather shoes. He collected the moments just before the vanishing. "Where is the boy, Thomas Alcott?" Thorn demanded, his voice echoing fiercely in the silence. The archivist smiled, a chillingly gentle curve of his lips. "The Alcott collection? He is in the final chamber. He is still, perfectly still. You see, Mr. Thorn, life is chaos, blur, motion. But I collect moments of absolute, unspoiled stillness. I am the archivist of silence. I captured his perfect stillness just before the inevitable, terrible motion of life could ruin him." He pointed to a closed, carved oak door near the back wall, sealed with a brass plaque. The plaque was engraved with a single name and date: T. Alcott, 1893. The collector was not a kidnapper seeking ransom, he was an artistic madman, a morbid preservationist who sought to finalize the post-mortem portrait through the act of collecting the subject's final, quiet moment. The chilling calm of the archivist's confession was broken by the sound of Elias Thorne bringing his lamp down hard on the massive clock, shattering its glass case and silencing the obsessive thump, thump, thump. The sudden quiet was heavy, giving way only to the distant, muffled sounds of the market above. Thorne lunged toward the oak door marked T. Alcott, 1893. The archivist, moving with a surprising, skeletal speed, attempted to intervene, but Thorne drove the point of his lamp's broken casing into the man's chest. The archivist crumpled, a look of profound sorrow, rather than pain, on his pale face. He mourned the end of his precious stillness. The lock on the final chamber was heavy, but Thorne managed to smash the brass plaque and force the door open with a splintering groan. He found not a coffin, but a small, meticulously arranged bedroom. In the center, Thomas Alcott lay upon a pristine white bed, his eyes gently closed. He was dressed in clean, new clothes, and his hands were folded over a small, wooden toy soldier, the one Thorne had found in the tunnel. Thomas was utterly, tragically still. The boy was dead, preserved in the very moment of his perfect, unblemished finality. His death had been clinical, quick, and devoid of violence, achieving the collector's ultimate, sickening goal, the eternal, post-mortem portrait. Thorne stumbled back, choking on the chemical scent of preservation. He had found the truth, but it was far more terrible than any murder he had imagined. The subsequent investigation was swift and brutal. The archivist, a respected, if eccentric, former curator of a city museum, was taken into custody, babbling about the beauty of absolute stillness. The sunken vault was sealed, his horrifying collection dismantled, and Thomas Alcott was finally returned to the cold earth above. Yet, the vanishing left an enduring mark. The watcher had been caught, but the sea tribute continued. Years later, locals swear that on nights when the fog is thick and crimson ribbon-like weeds wash up on the shore, a faint, rhythmic thump, 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 can still be heard emanating from the forgotten foundations beneath the bustling fish market, an echo of the obsession, and a chilling reminder that sometimes, the most profound darkness is found not in malice, but in a madman's gentle need for things to simply stay still.